ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, stunned the global community in 2014 when it poured over the Syrian border into Iraq. Born amid the chaos of the Syrian civil war and post-invasion Iraq, ISIS represents an enormous challenge to the US and world powers who seek to stop the spread of its virulent and dangerous form of Islamic extremism.
Even if you were to defeat ISIS militarily, I don't think it would end the phenomenon of jihadism.
Its rampage has been marked by war crimes. These include the summary execution of battlefield prisoners, including Muslims deemed unholy, the wholesale slaughter of civilians, and genocidal policies toward ethnic minorities. Combating ISIS will be a focal point for the US and its allies for years to come. The rise of ISIS, next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Una Chapman Cox Foundation.
The roots of ISIS can be found in the turmoil following the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein was removed from power. A secular leader from Iraq's Sunni minority, he had ruled with an iron fist, directing much of his brutality at its Shiite majority.
He clamped down on everybody. If you were thought to be against Saddam, you had a visit from the Mukhabarat, from the intelligence services, and very likely that's the last your family would see of you.
The way in which he ruled as Saddam was to use Baathism, which is an Arab nationalist secular ideology, but to give it an Islamic kind of tinge that really didn't focus too much on the sectarian dimension of Sunni versus Shia, not permitting sectarianism to be a language to be used in combating or in dominating Iraqi society.
To many Iraqis, mostly Sunni but Shia as well, the invasion was a violation of their sovereignty. The blow was worsened by the decision to disband the Iraqi military.
One of the things the United States did so poorly in Iraq is it decimated a part of the bureaucracy that was actually working.
We've got to first get law and order back. We've got to get basic services back. We've got to deal with the de-Baathification of this country.
I think it would be really hard to get into the head of Paul Bremer and say, why did you do de-Baathification as well as the disbanding of the Iraqi army? I think looking back is very easy to say this was a very dumb idea. I think most people would agree.
In our opinion polling, which we did every 3 weeks while I was there, it was the single most popular thing we did. It never polled below 94% popularity. The mistake, which I made, was to turn the implementation of this very narrowly drawn decree over to Iraqi politicians. They broadened its effect, and I had to reverse that, using it as part of their political struggle. I should have found some Iraqi judges to be the organizing body to implement this.
Before long, thousands of armed men were unemployed and growing angrier by the day. They soon formed insurgent groups to drive out the American occupiers.
It was a combination of factors. Here is a country that already had war going on. It had not only people who were unemployed and disaffected socially, you had people who were very disaffected politically, namely the members of Saddam's army which had been dissolved.
All the de-Baathification decree said was that the top 1% only of the party could not have jobs in the government. They were free to set up newspapers. More than 100 newspapers were set up just in the 2 weeks after I got there. They were free to have radio programs. They could set up a store. They could leave the country. As long as they weren't criminals, they could fully participate in the life of Iraq, except they could not draw a government salary.
According to Salafi jihadi ideology, if an Muslim land is conquered by non-Muslim forces, that forms a legitimate pretext for rallying Muslim troops. Everyone really who is a Muslim is duty-bound to come and defend that territory.
The 2003 overthrow of Saddam not only threw out Saddam Hussein, effectively it upended a 1,000-year domination of the lands between the rivers, Mesopotamia, a 1,000-year domination by the Sunnis. Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. The overthrow of Saddam was also effectively a political revolution. And understandably, the Sunni Arabs felt threatened by the idea that his dictatorship would be replaced by representative government.
Once secular Iraq was now home to Islamic extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi.
Frankly, the mismanagement by the U.S. of the post-Saddam period in Iraq probably didn't create Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or other radical Islamic movements, but it probably gave them arguments with which they broadened their numbers and strengthened their terrorist cause.
Abu Musab al-Zarqawi is a Jordanian individual who essentially was a thug, interested in the global jihadi movement, fighting for the defense of Muslims in areas that were occupied by non-Muslim armies. He created Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, and was killed in 2006. Very soon after that, something called the Islamic State in Iraq was created.
During the war in Iraq, the Syrian border became a revolving door of various jihadis. Some of them were Al-Qaeda in Iraq under Zarqawi's group. Some of them were just other foreign fighters. The Assad regime was allowing that border to become essentially a way to undermine the U.S. forces in Iraq.
While the U.S. and a newly formed Iraqi military fought the insurgency, American officials worked with Iraqi leaders to establish the rule of law and to form democratic government institutions.
You could have a representative body of 500, but how would you ever make it work? So we wound up anyway with a representative group of men and women of 25. They represented Shia, Sunnis, Kurds, Turkmen, Yazidis, Christians. It was an imperfect process, but it did wind up with a representative interim government that was in place within 2 months of my arrival.
They drew out a roadmap for transition from occupation to an interim government and then finally to an elected government.
Shiite leaders, long on the receiving end of Saddam's cruelty, used the sudden reversal of fortune to seek revenge on Sunnis. The pattern of reprisals permeated government and civil society.
After the 2010 election, when Prime Minister Maliki returned to power, he systematically excluded Sunnis and Kurds from the government, limited their influence, allowed sectarian to undercut professionalism in the Iraqi security forces.
A governing body that was inclusive enough to deal with a Sunni minority was a crucial test of democracy building in Iraq, and it's a test that the Iraqis have failed.
Today, I can report that, as promised, the rest of our troops in Iraq will come home by the end of the year.
When the U.S. officially withdrew in 2011, Iraq's internal divisions remained.
When the Americans left, the Iraqi regime in Baghdad, which was a sectarian Shiite regime, pursued a set of very discriminatory policies with regard to the Sunnis, and that radicalized them and now resurrected Islamic State in Iraq.
In Syria, President Bashar al-Assad, like Saddam Hussein, had long served as a Shiite authoritarian ruler, oppressing the country's majority Sunni population.
The Arab Spring, I really think, was finally a manifestation of people saying, we want a better life. We're looking around the world and we want some of that. You know, we want a higher standard of living, we want more opportunities, we want jobs, we want more political freedom.
Assad thought that his country was immune to the wave of Arab Spring demonstrations and demands for greater accountability. The Syrians, however, did begin to demonstrate against him, which were repressively dealt with by the Assad regime. So his use of violence against his own people eventually led to the civil war that we see today.
As the fighting wore on and Sunni groups weren't able to oust Assad, some united under a different banner, ISIS. Inspired by al-Zarqawi, ISIS declared the founding of an Islamic caliphate.
We finally kill Zarqawi, but this group kind of lives on in a way, and once the Syrian war opens up, that gives it a new front.
The former Saddam loyalists basically became more radicalized along with the Sunni population towards the ideology of the Islamic State. Many of them have joined up with the Islamic State and seem to play a key role in intelligence gathering, the security and military structure of the movement.
ISIS, or the Al-Qaeda that sort of morphed into ISIS, takes advantage of some of the ungoverned spaces and some of the opportunities that the instability in Syria created for them.
Now what you have is, in Syria, really a geopolitical Chernobyl that is just spewing instability that affects the rest of the region.
ISIS expanded from Syria into Iraq in 2014. They would soon broaden their reach further with an attack in Paris.
There is no question that one of the great elements for the recruitment of the Islamic State has been the reaction against Shia militias by Sunnis, and that a number of people who are in the Islamic States are former Saddam Hussein officers, which explains part of their military effectiveness.
The Assad regime in Syria has given the Islamic State the ideological room to grow because they're presenting themselves as the protector of the Sunni community in Syria and in Iraq against the Shiite regime of Bashar al-Assad, supported by their main Shiite patron, the government of Iran.
I think it's been reassuring to see Prime Minister Abadi in Iraq talk about what he knows needs to be done. And he has to reach out to the Sunni Arabs. He's got to get them back into the fold. He's got to constantly seek the right deal, if you will. I think this is all doable, but it is certainly extremely difficult.
ISIS differs from extremist groups that have come before. It holds territory, and it's the first jihadist group to declare a present-day Islamic caliphate.
The caliphate is a very powerful idea that can mobilize people to its cause because it claims to be the authentic form of the Islamic State from the 7th century that rejects the global order that was imposed by the West on the Middle East. So it has a tremendous appeal as a mobilizing ideology.
They are acting almost kind of like a group that is providing public services, and they are collecting taxes and other things that rebel groups have done in the past.
They are trying to manage a state. It's part, it's a slogan, but in part it's a reality. They do administer territory. And so they combine the appeal of a franchise like Al-Qaeda with the reality of a state. And combining that is both attractive and dangerous for them.
They believe in a return to a different geographic reality and a hearkening back to a time when the Arabs were so powerful and when Islam was really the centerpiece of the civilization.
Despite early talks of unity, ISIS and Al-Qaeda are now suffering from what appear to be irreconcilable differences.
Quickly, a division developed between elements that were loyal to Al-Qaeda Central and elements that were loyal to the Islamic State in Iraq.
The ideology of using kind of these real brutal tactics, reintroducing slavery, some of these things that even Al-Qaeda would never have considered, but I'm not sure that a lot of the recruits are necessarily ideologically driven. I think they're more motivated by some of the adventure behind it.
The Islamic State's brutality has failed to make a dent in its popularity.
You've seen in now Syria and Iraq extremists and terrorists coming from over 100 countries, thousands from Europe, even hundreds from America.
We're seeing franchises develop in Libya, in Boko Haram in Nigeria and other places. That's more of a function, I think, of the fact that they're surging in popularity and strength and numbers.
The Islamic State has found a balance that is quite appealing to many disenfranchised people, including in developed countries. You have the fighters in Europe that join the Islamic State because they don't feel they have a place in their own country.
I'm from the UK. My name is Abu Abdullah Al-Habashi. We don't need any democracy, we don't need any communism, we don't need anything like that. All we need is Sharia.
ISIS engages in intense marketing through social media to recruit jihadists the world over.
The recruitment, the use of social media, the kind of selling of this perverse dream is what's arguably one of the most powerful elements of ISIS, how they recruit people.
Al-Qaeda felt that information had to be protected, that secrecy was important, that confidentiality was important, and therefore they stayed off the social media. ISIS has decided actually that the way you hide is in plain sight and has used social media very effectively to get out their message and as a recruiting tool.
Iraq and Syria's neighbors are overwhelmed by hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing the fighting.
Assad has, as a result of his policies, led to the killing of anywhere between 200 and 300,000 people, at least, and led to half the population of Syria becoming refugees. Many of them are in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, but there are also internally displaced people within Syria.
We're seeing this massive humanitarian crisis that's taken place. And a big part, let's face it, it is about what ISIS is doing.
All of its neighbors have been effectively crippled and are distracted by all of the amount of social problems in their own countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey.
Turkey must defend its borders and prevent foreign fighters from crossing through its territory to join ISIS. It's also worried that Kurdish separatists may use the conflict to secede.
The way many of these extremists who come from other countries are getting to the fight is they're going across the Turkish border between Turkey and Syria.
The Turks are really nervous about that, and they've been almost kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend dynamic going on, where they are allowing their 500-mile border with Syria to basically allow various amounts of foreign fighters to come through.
Today, as part of an international coalition of some 60 nations, including Arab countries, our men and women in uniform continue to fight against ISIL in Iraq and in Syria.
The U.S. is leading an international coalition to, as Washington describes it, degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS.
A strategy that does not address the underlying political issues, a narrow counter-terrorist strategy cannot work, because you will never drain the swamp. You will kill some terrorists and then others will come up. It's politics that will defeat terrorism. It's not military force in the end.
The other problem with the US attack on the Islamic State through airplanes, while effectively using either Kurds or Shiites to fight the Islamic State on the ground, is that it looks like the United States is in alliance with Iran. And this confirms the Islamic State's ideology that all Sunnis are being persecuted because they're Sunnis.
Dozens of countries are united to defeat ISIS militarily and are working to cut off ISIS finances and stop its oil trade on the black market.
They've looted banks to get cash. They have controlled refineries in order to sell oil on the black market. And of course, they've had a kidnapping and ransoming network that has netted them millions of dollars.
ISIS has gotten its money effectively from things like extortion, from kidnapping, from oil revenues, but also from private sugar daddies in the Kuwait and Qatar and elsewhere in the Gulf.
Critics say the current policy won't defeat ISIS, it will merely contain it. And the attacks in Paris call even that into question.
I think the president has correctly stated what the objective should be. He says to degrade and destroy ISIS is his objective. And I think in order to accomplish that, we have to do more.
I don't think ISIS can be defeated unless troops are actually sent on the ground to fight ISIS.
I don't see which force is going to really push them back, frankly, because air power can take out leaders, it can limit their offensive capacity, it will not claim back territory.
Washington has ruled out the large-scale redeployment of U.S. ground forces to Iraq, a decision that resonates with an American public weary of war.
I'm not sure there's much appetite in the United States for us to go back in with troops in large numbers. I can't imagine what circumstances would propel us to doing that.
There's been talk of doing a kind of hammer and anvil approach where you essentially use airstrikes and you also have special forces, but I don't know if there's a lot of stomach.
Even if it goes in and takes over a country and installs leadership and keeps hundreds of thousands of troops there for a really long period of time, there are limits to what can be achieved unless the United States wants to completely own the country, which the United States does not want to do, the American public does not want to do.
The U.S. sent thousands of military advisors to assist the Iraqi military, but that policy has proven disappointing. In some instances, Iraqi forces fled confrontations with ISIS instead of fighting.
Now, part of this is not America's fault. The Iraqis have not made the kinds of decisions and taken the kinds of steps they need to do.
The rise of ISIS shows you how little was done and how ineffective it has been, particularly if the army is fighting for leadership that is deemed as corrupt and not pluralistic and not interested in holding Iraq together.
Now opinion is divided on whether the U.S. should scale back or ramp up its fight, with more intense bombing and the large-scale deployment of ground troops.
You can compare the number of bombings, for instance, that opened up the Persian Gulf War in the early 1990s, or the campaign in Afghanistan, or the Second Iraq War in the early part of the last decade, to the number of bombings we're doing today. And they're very, very small compared to those early air campaigns.
The more important thing is we don't have forward air controllers on the ground to spot the targets and to do the bomb damage assessment after the strikes. And everybody that I speak to in the military point out that you really need those forward air controllers if the strikes are going to be effective.
We're going to have to help the Iraqis develop their own ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability. But I think it will also require U.S. forces to be willing to embed initially with Iraqi units that we've trained.
The other option then is we train Syrian moderate opposition groups, but we've trained 60 or something like that. How do you vet somebody in the opposition? Somebody who's a moderate today might be not a moderate tomorrow.
While the U.S. may be leading the fight, the solution to destroying ISIS won't be devised by the U.S. alone. It will be alongside partners.
The Middle East is at the crossroads of civilization, and it has been for eons. The United States cannot disinvest from the Middle East. We always are going to be committed in the region and a force for good if we choose to remain committed.
If we get rid of Baghdadi tomorrow and you defeat ISIS, you're still going to have these disaffected Sunnis in Iraq, and you're still going to have a Syrian civil war. How do we resolve the Syrian civil war? I haven't seen that in any kind of policy statement coming out of Washington.
To engage a range of groups before they join a global franchise like the Islamic State, I think that's very important. If you don't do that, you're going to see more and more of those groups joining that kind of global franchise. And maybe the Islamic State as such will be defeated, but then something else will appear.
The ideology basically is one that feeds off of the sense of disenfranchisement that Sunni Arabs in particular feel with respect to the rise of Shia power throughout the region. So even if you were to defeat ISIS militarily, I don't think it would end the phenomenon of jihadism. Sunni jihadism is rooted in a deeper set of structural problems in the region.
With no clear path to fill the power vacuum in the Middle East, degrading and destroying ISIS may just be one more battle in a long war.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet in community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit greatdecisions.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Una Chapman Cox Foundation.
Next time on Great Decisions. America has few allies in the Middle East, more stalwart than the Iraqi Kurds. Now the U.S. is looking to its Kurdish allies to help stop the advance of ISIS. With Iraq's borders threatened, Kurds may see an opportunity to fulfill their dream of forming a fully independent state. The Kurds, next time on Great Decisions.